The Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing room carried the weight of institutional authority in every carved panel and marble column. Marco Rubio sat at the center of the dais with the posture of a man who had spent nearly 15 years in the United States Senate and knew exactly how to wield that seniority against witnesses who appeared before him. His suit was perfectly tailored, his notes organized in neat stacks, his expression carrying that particular brand of senatorial condescension reserved for people he considered beneath his expertise. The hearing was supposed to focus on State Department appropriations for Latin American aid programs, but Rubio had spent the first 12 minutes of his opening statement pivoting to immigration policy, border security, and what he called the catastrophic failure of progressive politicians to understand the realities of national sovereignty. When Jasmine Crockett entered and took her seat at the witness table, she had been invited to testify about a border infrastructure proposal from the House. Rubio's eyes tracked her with visible disdain. He waited until she had settled, until the microphone had been adjusted, until the cameras had focused. Then he leaned into his own microphone with the smile of a prosecutor who believed he already had a confession. Congresswoman Crockett, welcome. I want to start by acknowledging that you're relatively new to Congress. You were elected in 22, so you've been in office for about 2 years now. Is that correct? His tone was that of a professor addressing a freshman who had wandered into a graduate seminar by mistake. Crockett's voice was calm, professional, entirely neutral. That's correct, Senator. Rubio nodded as if she had just confirmed something important. 2 years. So you wouldn't have extensive experience with foreign policy, diplomatic negotiations, or international aid programs. Would that be a fair assessment? Crockett's expression didn't change. I serve on the House Oversight Committee, which has jurisdiction over foreign aid accountability. I've reviewed budgets for USAID programs, State Department operations, and humanitarian assistance allocations. But you're correct that I haven't been in Congress as long as you've been in the Senate. Rubio's smile widened slightly. He glanced at his colleagues on either side as if inviting them to appreciate what was about to happen. I appreciate your honesty. Because what concerns me, Congresswoman, is that you've come here today to testify about border infrastructure and Latin American engagement, but your actual expertise in this area seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, largely theoretical. You've read some budgets. You've sat in some committee hearings, but you haven't negotiated with foreign governments. You haven't crafted international agreements. You haven't spent years developing relationships with Latin American leaders the way some of us in this chamber have. So I have to ask, what qualifies you to tell the United States Senate how to conduct foreign policy in a region I've spent my entire career studying? He sat back, hands folded, the picture of a man who had just delivered a checkmate move in front of multiple cameras. The room was silent. Several reporters looked up from their laptops. The other senators on the committee shifted in their seats, some looking uncomfortable, others watching with the detached interest of people observing a confrontation they had no intention of interrupting. Crockett remained perfectly still. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, her posture straight, her face showing nothing. When she spoke, her voice carried the same measured calm it had before, as if Rubio had asked about the weather rather than attempted to publicly humiliate her. Senator Rubio, I appreciate the question. I'm here today because the House Oversight Committee requested that I present findings from our investigation into border infrastructure spending. I'm not here to tell the Senate how to conduct foreign policy. I'm here to present evidence about how appropriated funds have been used, misused, or in some cases, never used at all. If you'd like to discuss my qualifications after I present that evidence, I'm happy to do so. But perhaps it would be more productive to let me finish my prepared testimony first. Rubio's expression flickered with something that might have been irritation. Congresswoman, I've reviewed your testimony. What I'm questioning is whether someone with your limited background has the expertise to evaluate complex international programs that involve diplomatic considerations you may not fully understand. No disrespect intended, but this isn't a domestic policy hearing. This is foreign relations. The stakes are significantly higher. Crockett nodded slowly as if she were carefully considering his concern. Then she opened the folder in front of her. The sound was soft, but somehow carried across the entire room. Rubio's eyes moved to the folder. Something in his posture changed almost imperceptibly. His shoulders straightened. Senator, you mentioned that you've spent your career developing relationships with Latin American leaders. I want to make sure we're working from the same factual foundation. In your 15 years in the Senate, you've served on this committee for approximately 12 years. Is that accurate? Rubio's chin lifted slightly. That's correct. I've been a member of the Foreign Relations Committee since 2013, and I chaired the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee for 6 years. I think my record speaks for itself. Crockett's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. I'm sure it does, Senator. And in that capacity, you've been instrumental in shaping U.S. policy toward Latin America, particularly regarding foreign aid appropriations. You've advocated for significant funding increases for programs in Colombia, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Is that also accurate? Rubio leaned forward slightly, his tone taking on the quality of a teacher pleased that a student had done at least some homework. Yes, I fought for aid to countries that are combating drug cartels, corruption, and the conditions that drive illegal immigration. These are investments in regional stability. Investments that progressives often oppose because they don't understand how diplomacy actually works. Crockett lifted a single page from her folder, holding it briefly so the cameras could register its existence before placing it on the table. Senator, this is the appropriations summary for the Western Hemisphere account from fiscal year 2019. The year you chaired the subcommittee, total appropriations for Central American aid programs, $1.4 billion. You personally testified before the Appropriations Committee advocating for that funding level. Do you recall that testimony? Rubio's expression shifted to one of obvious pride. I do. And that funding was critical for supporting anti-corruption efforts, law enforcement training, and economic development programs. Exactly the kind of strategic investment that actually addresses root causes. Crockett's next question came with the precision of a scalpel finding bone. Senator, of that $1.4 billion appropriated in fiscal year 2019, how much was actually disbursed to the intended programs? Rubio's face showed brief confusion. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but the money was appropriated. The programs were funded? That's how appropriations work. Crockett reached into her folder and withdrew a second document, this one thicker, stapled in the corner. This is the Government Accountability Office report on Western Hemisphere aid disbursement for fiscal year 2019. It was published in July 2020. According to the GAO, of the $1.4 billion appropriated, only $640 million was actually disbursed during the fiscal year. The remaining $760 million, more than half of the total appropriation, was either held in State Department accounts, reprogrammed to other uses, or returned to the Treasury unspent. Were you aware of this, Senator? The room's energy shifted instantly. Rubio's hands came together on the desk in front of him, fingers interlacing in a gesture that read as defensive rather than authoritative. Disbursement timelines are managed by the State Department. There are often legitimate delays for vetting, contracting, and program implementation. That doesn't mean the money disappeared. Crockett's tone did not change. Still measured? Still calm. You're absolutely correct that disbursement involves implementation steps. But $760 million unspent from a single fiscal year isn't a delay, Senator. It's a failure. And it's particularly concerning when you spent that entire year publicly claiming that the funding you fought for was actively combating corruption and gang violence in Central America, when in reality most of it was sitting in government accounts doing nothing. Rubio's jaw tightened visibly. Again, Congresswoman, disbursement is handled by career officials at state. I advocated for the funding. What happens in implementation is a separate issue. Crockett nodded with that same patient acknowledgement, as if she were a prosecutor allowing a witness to complete their answer before revealing the trap. She withdrew a third document from the folder, this one clipped to what appeared to be an email chain. Senator, this is an internal State Department memo from November 2019. It was obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by my office. The memo is from the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs to the Secretary of State. It explicitly states that disbursement of Central American aid funds was being intentionally delayed at the request of congressional oversight, specifically at your request. The memo notes that you had placed a hold on disbursement pending assurances from recipient governments on immigration enforcement cooperation. Were you aware that your hold prevented $760 million in anti-corruption funding from reaching the programs you publicly claimed were operational? The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Rubio's mouth opened slightly. His eyes moved from Crockett to the document in her hand and back to her face. The color in his cheeks began to deepen from a natural tan to something darker, redder. He did not speak. Crockett waited. 5 seconds. 10. The cameras were locked on Rubio's face. The other senators on the committee had stopped looking at their papers. Reporters in the gallery were frozen mid-keystroke. 15 seconds. 16. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning system and the soft mechanical whir of cameras adjusting focus. Finally, Rubio's voice emerged, but it had changed entirely. The professorial condescension was gone. What remained was defensive, uncertain, the tone of a man realizing he had walked into something he hadn't seen coming. I placed holds on disbursement because I had legitimate concerns about recipient government cooperation on shared priorities. That standard congressional oversight. Crockett's response was delivered with the gentleness of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding. Senator, you didn't place holds on disbursement because of legitimate oversight concerns. You placed holds because you wanted leverage in immigration negotiations. The State Department memo explicitly states that your office demanded recipient governments commit to immigration enforcement measures before you would release the aid. Those measures had nothing to do with anti-corruption programming. They were unrelated political conditions. And while you held that money hostage for leverage, you went on television repeatedly claiming that your aid packages were actively fighting cartels and stabilizing the region. That's not oversight. That's fraud. Rubio's hands left the desk. He gestured sharply, his voice rising. That's an outrageous accusation. I was ensuring U.S. interests were protected. That's exactly what congressional oversight is supposed to do. Crockett did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Senator, congressional oversight is supposed to ensure appropriated funds are used effectively for their intended purposes. It's not supposed to block those funds from being used at all while you publicly claim they're operational. You spent 12 months in 2019 doing media appearances talking about how your aid packages were reducing violence in Central America, but the money wasn't being spent. It was sitting in accounts blocked by your office. You lied to the American people about what that money was doing. That's not a policy disagreement. That's misrepresentation. She paused, then continued with surgical precision. But we're not done yet, because your hold on disbursement had consequences you never mentioned in any of those television appearances. She withdrew another document. A fourth. This one was a printed news article with sections highlighted in yellow. This is a report from the Associated Press dated March 2020. It documents a surge in gang-related violence in Honduras and El Salvador during the final quarter of 2019. Homicide rates increased 41% compared to the previous year. The report specifically notes that U.S.-funded anti-gang task forces had been suspended due to funding interruptions. Those task forces were supposed to be funded by the $760 million you were holding. While you were blocking the money for immigration leverage, people were dying in the exact countries you claimed to be helping. Were you aware of this, Senator? Rubio's face had gone from red to something approaching pale. His breathing was visible now, his chest rising and falling in short movements. His hands gripped the edge of the desk. I cannot be held responsible for violence committed by criminal organizations. That's absurd. Crockett's voice dropped even lower, carrying a weight that was somehow more devastating than shouting. You're not being held responsible for the violence, Senator. You're being held responsible for blocking the funding that was supposed to combat it while simultaneously claiming credit for combating it. You can't have it both ways. You can't hold up aid, watch violence surge, and then go on Fox News claiming your leadership is making the region safer. That's not leadership. That's negligence disguised as foreign policy expertise. She reached into the folder one more time. A fifth document. This one was a transcript. Senator Rubio, on December 4th, 2019, you appeared on Face the Nation. The host asked you whether U.S. aid was making a difference in Central America. Would you like me to read your response, or do you remember what you said? Rubio's voice was barely audible. I'm sure I said the aid was making a difference. Crockett looked down at the transcript. You said, and I quote, the aid packages I fought for are currently operational in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. We have anti-gang task forces, anti-corruption prosecutors, and economic development programs actively working right now to address the root causes of migration. This is the kind of strategic investment that actually works. End quote. She looked up. Senator, on December 4th, 2019, when you made that statement on national television, how much of the $1.4 billion you had fought for was actually disbursed and operational? Rubio stared at her. His mouth opened. No sound came. Crockett answered her own question. According to the GAO report, as of December 2019, approximately $640 million had been disbursed. $760 million was still blocked, largely due to your hold. The anti-gang task forces you mentioned had been suspended. The anti-corruption prosecutors were operating without U.S. support because the funding was frozen. The economic development programs were delayed indefinitely. When you told the American people those programs were actively working right now, you were describing programs that did not exist because you had personally prevented them from existing? That's not spin, Senator. That's a lie. The word hung in the committee room like a physical object. Several senators visibly winced. The ranking member started to interject, then stopped, apparently uncertain whether defending Rubio was wise given what was unfolding. Rubio's hands were shaking against the desk now. His voice, when it finally came, carried none of its earlier authority. I relied on information from State Department briefings. If I was given inaccurate information about operational status, Crockett cut him off with the precision of a blade. Senator, you weren't given inaccurate information. You placed the hold. Your office knew the money wasn't being spent because your office was the reason it wasn't being spent. The State Department memo I showed you earlier includes email correspondence with your chief of staff confirming that you were aware disbursement was frozen pending your conditions being met. You knew the programs weren't operational. You went on television and said they were anyway. That's not relying on bad information. That's deliberate misrepresentation. Rubio tried one more defense, his voice rising with desperation-tinged anger. I was protecting American interests. I was ensuring that countries receiving our aid were cooperating on immigration. That's my job as a senator representing border security concerns. Crockett's response was immediate and devastating. Senator, you don't represent border security. You represent Florida. Florida is not a border state. It shares no land border with any foreign country. But you've spent 15 years in the Senate positioning yourself as a border security expert, blocking aid to Central American countries while claiming to fight the root causes of migration and lying about what that aid is actually accomplishing. You humiliated me at the start of this hearing for having only 2 years of experience. Let me tell you what I learned in those 2 years. I learned to read GAO reports. I learned to file FOIA requests. I learned to check whether the programs politicians claim credit for actually exist.